At 5 feet 2 inches and 115 pounds, Sam Ruiz looked more like someone who belonged behind a desk than behind a machine gun. When she walked into the armory at Fort Braxton, North Carolina, requesting assignment to heavy weapons training, the laughter could be heard 3 buildings away. What they didn't know was that Sam carried something far more dangerous than size or strength. She carried the unshakable determination of someone who'd been underestimated her entire life. This is the story of how a woman deemed too small for combat became the soldier who held the line when 200 enemy fighters thought they'd found an easy target. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Fort Braxton stood against the Carolina pines like a monument to American military might. Its red brick buildings and precision-maintained grounds, reflecting a tradition that stretched back to World War II, the base had earned its reputation as one of the Army's premier training facilities, where elite units prepared for deployments that would test every ounce of their skill and courage. This wasn't a place for the weak, the hesitant, or the unprepared. It was a forge where soldiers were hammered into weapons of precision and power. The heavy weapons division occupied Building 47, a massive concrete structure that housed everything from mortar to mounted machine guns. The building itself seemed designed to intimidate, with its fortress-like walls and the constant sound of gunfire echoing from the indoor ranges. Above the main entrance, a bronze plaque bore the division's motto, "Overwhelming force, decisive victory." It was a philosophy that had been proven in countless conflicts, where superior firepower had turned the tide of battle. Staff Sergeant Marcus Thompson ran the heavy weapons division with the iron discipline of a man who'd seen 3 combat deployments and earned his respect through blood and sacrifice. At 6 feet 4 inches and 220 pounds of solid muscle, Thompson embodied everything the division represented, raw power channeled through military precision. His weathered hands bore the calluses of thousands of hours behind machine guns, and his steel gray eyes held the confidence of someone who'd never met a weapon he couldn't master. Thompson's training philosophy was simple. Heavy weapons required heavy soldiers. The M240 Bravo machine gun weighed 27 pounds unloaded, and in combat, gunners carried additional weight in ammunition, tripods, and support equipment that could total over 100 pounds. Physical strength wasn't just preferred, it was considered essential for survival. The machine gunner's role was to lay down suppressive fire that could pin down entire enemy units, and any weakness in the gun team could mean disaster for the entire platoon. The division's culture reflected this philosophy. The machine gunners were the giants of the infantry, men whose very presence commanded respect in mess halls and barracks. They walked with the swagger of soldiers who knew they carried the heaviest firepower on the battlefield. Their conversations revolved around ammunition counts, barrel changes, and the satisfaction of watching enemy positions disintegrate under sustained fire. It was a brotherhood forged in shared understanding that when things got desperate, everyone looked to the machine guns for salvation. Specialist Jake Morrison epitomized this culture. At 6 feet 2 inches and 195 pounds, he'd been the division's poster boy since arriving at Fort Braxton 18 months earlier. His social media was filled with photos of him behind various machine guns, flexing muscles that had been sculpted through years of dedicated training. Morrison had never seen combat, but his technical scores were impressive, and his physical presence made him the natural choice for recruiting videos and demonstration events. The other machine gunners formed a tight circle around Morrison's leadership. Corporal Brian Hendricks, a former college football player whose massive frame made the M240 look like a toy in his hands. Sergeant Tom Bradley, whose family had served in every major American conflict since Vietnam and who spoke about machine gunnery like it was a sacred tradition passed down through generations. These men had created an environment where physical intimidation was confused with tactical competence, where the ability to carry heavy equipment was valued more than the wisdom to use it. Effectively, the training facilities reflected this emphasis on brute force over finesse. The ranges were designed for sustained fire exercises that tested endurance more than accuracy. Qualification courses required soldiers to carry machine guns over obstacle courses that favored raw strength rather than tactical thinking. The entire system had evolved to select soldiers who could overpower their weapons rather than those who understood how to become one with them. Female soldiers were not officially barred from the heavy weapons division, but the informal barriers were nearly insurmountable. The physical requirements had been set at levels that excluded most women, and the culture made it clear that those who somehow managed to qualify would face constant scrutiny and doubt. In Tonson's 15 years of running the division, only 3 women had attempted the training, and all had been quietly counseled toward other specialties after failing to meet the unofficial standards that went far beyond the written requirements. The base's Command Sergeant Major Patricia Collins had been pushing for more inclusive policies, recognizing that modern warfare required diverse skill sets that went beyond traditional measures of strength. But her efforts had met resistance from old-school commanders who believed that certain roles were simply not suitable for anyone who couldn't physically dominate their equipment. The Heavy Weapons Division had become a symbol of this resistance, a last bastion where traditional military culture could maintain its grip on what it considered the essential nature of combat. This was the world that Sam Ruiz was about to enter, a fortress of masculine pride built on the assumption that vigor was always better, that physical presence equated to tactical effectiveness, and that anyone who didn't fit the mold simply didn't belong. The men of Building 47 had never encountered anyone who would challenge their fundamental beliefs about warfare, strength, and the nature of courage itself. As Sam Ruiz approached the imposing structure of Building 47 on that humid Carolina morning, she carried with her not just a transfer request, but the potential to shatter everything these soldiers thought they knew about what it meant to be a warrior. The concrete walls might house the Army's most powerful weapons, but they were about to discover that the most dangerous thing that could walk through their doors wasn't a new piece of equipment. It was a soldier with something to prove, preparing. And narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The heavy steel door of Building 47 swung open with a metallic groan that seemed to announce Sam Ruiz's arrival to every soldier within 100 yards. The morning heat hadn't yet settled into the concrete structure, but the air already carried the familiar scent of gun oil, cleaning solvent, and the lingering residue of countless rounds fired in training. Sam stepped across the threshold, carrying a manila folder containing her transfer orders and a determination that had been forged through years of being told she didn't belong in places where others thought she was too small to matter. At first glance, Sam Ruiz defied every expectation the Heavy Weapons Division had established for incoming soldiers. Her regulation SCU uniform hung properly on her compact frame, but next to the towering figures that dominated the building's corridors, she appeared almost childlike. Her dark hair was pulled back in the standard military bun, and her brown eyes held an intensity that most people missed on first encounter. They were too busy calculating her height and weight to notice the steel beneath the surface. The main corridor of Building 47 was lined with photographs of legendary machine gunners from conflicts spanning decades. Images of soldiers manning .50 caliber positions in Korea, M60 teams in Vietnam, and modern M240 crews in Iraq and Afghanistan covered the walls like a hall of fame. Every face in those photographs belonged to men who looked like they could bench press their weapons, soldiers whose physical presence commanded respect before they ever fired a shot. The message was clear. This was a place where giants walked, and anything less than overwhelming physical dominance was a liability. Specialist Morrison was the first to spot Sam as she navigated toward the administrative office. He'd been discussing barrel change techniques with Corporal Hendricks near a display case containing various machine gun components when movement caught his eye. His conversation stopped mid-sentence as he processed what he was seeing, a soldier who barely reached his shoulder carrying paperwork into their sacred domain. "Hey, Hendricks," Morrison said, his voice carrying the lazy confidence of someone accustomed to being the biggest person in any room. "Check out the lost boot. Probably looking for the admin building." His comment was pitched loud enough to attract attention from other soldiers in the vicinity, heads turning to witness what Morrison clearly considered entertainment rather than the arrival of a new team member. Hendricks, whose college football background had taught him to evaluate opponents with a glance, shook his head with amusement. "Maybe she's delivering mail or something. No way that's a transfer request." The casual dismissal in his voice reflected an assumption so deeply ingrained that questioning it would have required these soldiers to examine beliefs they'd never thought to challenge. Sam could hear their commentary, but didn't acknowledge it. She'd learned long ago that engaging with every comment about her size was a losing strategy that only encouraged more attention. Instead, she maintained her focus on reaching Staff Sergeant Thompson's office, where her transfer orders would either be accepted or rejected based on regulations rather than assumptions about her physical capabilities. The administrative area occupied a corner of Building 47 that had been designed for efficiency rather than intimidation. Thompson's office sat behind a glass partition that allowed him to observe the training areas while handling paperwork and personnel matters. Through that glass, he watched Sam approach with the expression of someone trying to solve a puzzle. That didn't quite make sense. Thompson had been expecting the arrival of Private Rodriguez, a transfer from Fort Hood whose file indicated promise for heavy weapons training. What he hadn't expected was this diminutive figure carrying what appeared to be official paperwork. His initial assumption was that Sam represented some kind of administrative error, perhaps a clerical mistake that had sent the wrong soldier to his division. "Can I help you, soldier?" Thompson asked as Sam knocked on his office doorframe. His tone was professional but carried the subtle condescension of someone addressing a person who'd obviously made a wrong turn somewhere in the maze of military bureaucracy. "Staff Sergeant Thompson, I'm Specialist Sam Ruiz reporting for assignment to Heavy Weapons Division," Sam replied, extending her transfer orders with the crisp precision of someone who understood that military courtesy could serve as armor against informal prejudice. Her voice carried a slight Texas accent that spoke of border towns and communities where strength was measured by endurance rather than size. Thompson accepted the paperwork with visible confusion, his eyes moving between the official documents and the soldier standing before him. The transfer orders were legitimate, properly signed and dated, requesting assignment of Specialist Samantha Ruiz to heavy weapons training effective immediately. What made no sense was the disconnect between the official nature of the request and his assessment of the soldier making it. "There must be some mistake," Thompson said after reviewing the documents twice. "These orders are for heavy weapons training, machine gun specialization." His tone suggested that he was providing helpful clarification for someone who'd obviously misunderstood her assignment. "No mistake, Staff Sergeant," Sam replied evenly. "I requested transfer to your division specifically for M240 training. I'm here to earn my qualification as a machine gunner." The certainty in her voice contrasted sharply with Thompson's growing disbelief, creating a tension that began to attract attention from soldiers throughout the administrative area. By now, Morrison had drifted closer to Thompson's office, ostensibly checking on equipment maintenance schedules, but actually positioning himself to witness what he anticipated would be an entertaining conversation. Hendricks and Bradley had followed, creating an impromptu audience for what they expected to be a brief and amusing interaction before Sam was redirected to more appropriate duties. Thompson's military experience had taught him to follow regulations, regardless of personal opinions, but his practical experience running a heavy weapons division had also taught him that some soldiers simply weren't suited for certain roles. Looking at Sam Ruiz, he saw someone who would struggle to carry the basic load required for machine gun operations, let alone perform effectively under the stress of combat conditions. "Specialist Ruiz," Thompson began, his voice taking on the patient tone of someone explaining obvious facts to a confused child. "Heavy weapons training requires specific physical capabilities. The M240 weighs 27 pounds unloaded. In combat conditions, gunners carry additional equipment that can total over 100 pounds. This isn't about discrimination, it's about practical limitations and mission effectiveness." The soldiers gathered outside Thompson's office nodded approvingly at their sergeant's reasonable explanation. To them, this was simple mathematics. Sam's frame couldn't possibly handle the physical demands of their specialty. They expected her to acknowledge this obvious reality and request reassignment to a role more suited to her limitations. But Sam Ruiz didn't nod in understanding or apologize for the mistake. Instead, she stood straighter, her brown eyes meeting Thompson's with unwavering directness. "Staff Sergeant, I understand the physical requirements. I'm requesting the opportunity to demonstrate my capabilities rather than being judged solely on appearance. The regulations don't specify height or weight minimums for machine gunner training, only successful completion of qualification standards." The silence that followed was thick with disbelief. Morrison exchanged glances with Hendricks, both men struggling to process what they'd just heard. This tiny soldier was actually insisting on proceeding with training that would obviously end in failure and embarrassment. Thompson found himself in the uncomfortable position of having his assumptions challenged by regulations that technically supported Sam's request. "Specialist," Thompson said slowly, "I'm not questioning your courage or determination. But this division has standards that go beyond what's written in the manual. We prepare soldiers for combat conditions where weakness gets people killed. I have a responsibility to ensure that every gunner can perform when lives depend on it." Sam's response was immediate and precise. "Then test me, Staff Sergeant. If I can't meet your standards through performance, I'll accept reassignment. But I'm requesting the chance to prove myself through action rather than assumptions." The challenge was laid bare, witnessed by soldiers who'd never seen anyone question their division's fundamental beliefs about physical requirements and combat effectiveness. Thompson realized that refusing Sam's request might violate regulations, while accepting it seemed likely to result in injury or failure that would reflect poorly on his leadership. Outside the office, Morrison whispered to Hendricks, "This is going to be hilarious. She'll wash out in the first week." But beneath his confident mockery, something else was stirring a slight unease at the absolute certainty in Sam's voice, as if she knew something they didn't about what it meant to be a soldier. The news of Sam Ruiz's arrival spread through Fort Braxton's heavy weapons division like wildfire through dry timber. By noon, soldiers from neighboring units had found excuses to visit Building 47, drawn by stories of the miniature machine gunner who'd somehow convinced Staff Sergeant Thompson to let her attempt qualification training. The story grew with each telling. By some accounts, Sam was barely 5 feet tall and weighed less than the M240 she intended to operate. Thompson had reluctantly agreed to let Sam begin the preliminary training phase, but his decision came with conditions designed to protect both his reputation and what he perceived as her safety. Sam would undergo a probationary evaluation that included physical fitness assessments, equipment familiarization, and basic handling exercises before being allowed near live ammunition. The unofficial message to his staff was clear: document every struggle, every limitation, every moment that proved she didn't belong. The first public humiliation came during morning formation outside Building 47. Captain Robert Hayes, the company Commander had arrived unannounced to observe what he'd heard was an unusual personnel situation. Hayes was a career infantry officer whose own machine gun experience dated back to Iraq, and he carried himself with the authority of someone who'd earned his opinions through combat rather than classroom theory. "Which one is Ruiz?" Hayes asked Thompson as they stood before the assembled heavy weapons training class. His voice carried easily across the formation, ensuring every soldier could hear the question that reduced Sam to a curiosity rather than a fellow service member. Thompson pointed toward Sam, who stood in proper formation between two soldiers who dwarfed her by nearly a foot each. The visual contrast was stark enough to draw suppressed chuckles from the ranks, soldiers struggling to maintain military bearing while processing the absurdity of what they were witnessing. "Jesus Christ, Thompson," Hayes said, making no effort to lower his voice. "She looks like somebody's little sister who wandered into the wrong formation. You sure this isn't some kind of practical joke?" The comment triggered barely concealed laughter throughout the formation, soldiers exchanging glances that suggested their captain had voiced what everyone was thinking. Hayes approached Sam directly, his inspection as thorough as it was public. He walked around her like a drill instructor examining a recruit, but his purpose wasn't correction, it was spectacle. "Specialist Ruiz," he announced loudly. "I'm looking at someone who might weigh 115 pounds soaking wet, trying to qualify on a weapon system that weighs nearly a quarter of that unloaded. Help me understand the logic here." Sam maintained her position of attention, eyes focused straight ahead as military protocol demanded. "Sir, I believe my capability should be evaluated through performance rather than physical appearance," she replied, her voice steady despite the growing audience of soldiers who'd gathered to witness her public examination. "Performance," Hayes repeated, drawing out the word as if tasting something unpleasant. "Tell me, specialist, when you're carrying 100 pounds of equipment across rough terrain and enemy fire is incoming, will your good intentions stop bullets from finding their target when you can't maintain an effective rate of fire?" The question was designed to expose the fundamental flaw in Sam's request that warfare was ultimately about physics, and no amount of determination could overcome the mathematical reality of weight, endurance, and sustained combat operations. Hayes continued his verbal assault with the confidence of someone delivering an obvious truth to an audience that already agreed with his conclusions. "I've seen combat, specialist," Hayes continued, his tone taking on the authority of someone sharing hard-earned wisdom. "I've watched good soldiers die because someone in their unit couldn't pull their weight when it mattered. Machine gunners aren't just carrying weapons, they're carrying the survival of everyone who depends on suppressive fire to complete their mission." The formation had abandoned any pretense of military discipline, soldiers openly staring at the spectacle of their captain systematically dismantling Sam's credibility in front of the entire division. Phones appeared despite regulations against recording during formations, soldiers capturing what they expected would be viral content, showing the moment someone realized they were completely out of their depth. Sergeant Bradley, whose family military tradition gave him particular authority on matters of combat effectiveness, stepped forward to support his captain's assessment. "Sir, if I may," he said, his voice carrying the respectful tone of a subordinate offering valuable insight. "The M240 requires constant barrel changes during sustained fire. Those barrels are hot enough to cause severe burns and heavy enough to require significant upper body strength. It's not about discrimination, it's about preventing injuries that could compromise mission effectiveness." Hayes nodded approvingly at Bradley's contribution, turning back to Sam with an expression that suggested the case was now closed. "You hear that, specialist? This isn't about giving you a chance to prove yourself. This is about ensuring that when soldiers' lives depend on machine gun support, that support is provided by someone who can actually deliver it when it matters." The crowd had grown beyond the original formation to include soldiers from other divisions who'd heard about the confrontation Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez from the supply unit whispered to her companion, "This is painful to watch. Someone should stop this before it gets worse." But stopping it would have required challenging a captain in front of his soldiers, a career-limiting move that few were prepared to make. Morrison, emboldened by his captain's public support, decided to contribute his own expertise to the discussion. "Sir," he called out, "I've been training on the M240 for 18 months, and I can barely handle sustained fire exercises without serious fatigue. The recoil alone requires significant body mass to maintain accuracy during extended engagements." His comment drew nods of agreement from fellow machine gunners who saw themselves as providing technical validation for their captains. Position. The technical arguments continued with scientific precision. Corporal Hendricks cited ammunition, weight calculations, explaining how a typical combat load of linked rounds would require Sam to carry nearly half her body weight in bullets alone. Other soldiers contributed observations about tripod stability, emphasizing that machine gun effectiveness depended on steady platforms that required significant physical presence to maintain under combat stress. Hayes seemed to enjoy the educational opportunity, allowing his subordinates to build a comprehensive case for why Sam's request was not just unrealistic, but potentially dangerous to everyone who might serve alongside her. "You're hearing from soldiers with real experience, Specialist," he said. "These men understand what it takes to operate heavy weapons effectively in combat conditions." But throughout the extended public humiliation, Sam maintained her military bearing with an intensity that began to unsettle some observers. Her refusal to break, to acknowledge the obvious logic of their arguments, or to request relief from the increasingly hostile examination suggested either remarkable stubbornness or something else. Entirely a confidence that seemed completely disconnected from her apparent limitations. Colonel Patricia Collins, the base command sergeant major who'd been advocating for more inclusive policies, arrived during the latter part of Hayes's demonstration. She observed silently from the periphery, her expression unreadable as she watched a public spectacle that seemed designed more to humiliate than evaluate. Collins understood the dynamics at play. This wasn't about Sam's capabilities. It was about protecting a culture that had never been forced to examine its own assumptions. As the formation finally began to disperse, Hayes delivered what he intended as a face-saving conclusion. "Specialist Ruiz, I respect your determination, but I have a responsibility to ensure realistic expectations. I'm recommending that you consider specialties that better match your physical profile. There's no shame in recognizing limitations." The soldiers filed past Sam as they returned to their duties, some offering looks of pity, others barely concealed amusement. Morrison lingered just long enough to whisper, "This is just the beginning. Wait until you actually try to fire that weapon." His confidence was absolute. He'd just witnessed his captain systematically prove that. Sam Ruiz had no business in their division. What none of them had noticed during the extended public examination was how Sam's breathing had remained perfectly controlled throughout the ordeal, how her stance had never wavered despite the psychological pressure, and how her eyes had tracked every speaker with the focused attention of someone gathering intelligence rather than absorbing criticism. Thompson approached Sam after the formation dispersed, his expression mixing professional obligation with personal doubt. "Specialist, you've heard the concerns. Are you certain you want to proceed with this training? There's no dishonor in recognizing when a situation isn't the right fit." Sam's response was immediate and unwavering. "Staff Sergeant, I'd like to begin equipment familiarization immediately. When do we start?" The equipment familiarization room in Building 47 had been designed for intimidation as much as education. The M240 Bravo machine guns were mounted on tables like mechanical predators, their black metal surfaces gleaming under harsh fluorescent lights. Ammunition belts snaked across workbenches in precise coils, each linked round representing the devastating firepower that these weapons could unleash. The room's walls displayed cutaway diagrams, showing the intricate mechanisms that transformed human intent into overwhelming suppressive fire. Sam entered the room accompanied by Morrison, who'd volunteered to conduct her initial weapons handling assessment. Thompson had assigned Morrison the task partly because of his technical knowledge, but primarily because his imposing physical presence would provide a stark contrast that might finally convince Sam to recognize her limitations. Morrison approached the assignment with barely concealed anticipation. This would be his opportunity to demonstrate, with scientific precision, why some soldiers simply weren't built for heavy weapons. "All right, Ruiz," Morrison began, positioning himself beside the nearest M240 with the confidence of someone about to deliver an object lesson. "Let's start with basic handling. Pick up that weapon and tell me what you think about its weight distribution." His tone carried the patronizing patience of an instructor dealing with a student who was clearly out of their depth. Sam approached the machine gun with deliberate steps, her movements economical and precise. She positioned herself beside the weapon, checking that the bolt was locked in the forward position before lifting it from its mount. What happened next defied every expectation Morrison had harbored about her capabilities. Asterisk. Instead of struggling with the weapon's weight as Morrison had anticipated, Sam lifted the M240 with smooth, controlled motion. Her grip found the carrying handle and bipod legs with practiced familiarity, and she settled the weapon into a comfortable carry position that demonstrated clear understanding of proper handling techniques. The ease with which she maneuvered the 27-pound weapon drew immediate attention from other soldiers in the room. "Well," Morrison said, his voice betraying the first hint of uncertainty he'd shown since Sam's arrival, "that's adequate basic handling, but carrying a weapon is different from operating it effectively under stress." He moved to the next phase of his planned demonstration, determined to find the limitation that would expose Sam's unsuitability for heavy weapons. "Let's talk about barrel changes," Morrison continued, retrieving a spare barrel from the equipment rack. "During sustained fire, these barrels get hot enough to cause serious burns. The change procedure requires significant grip strength and precise timing to avoid damaging the weapon or injuring the operator." He demonstrated the barrel change procedure with exaggerated emphasis on the physical demands, his large hands making the process appear effortless. That Sam observed Morrison's demonstration with the focused attention of someone analyzing technique, rather than being intimidated by complexity. When he finished, she requested permission to attempt the procedure herself. Morrison agreed with visible amusement, expecting this to be the moment when Sam's limitations would become undeniably apparent. But Sam's barrel change was executed with mechanical precision that left Morrison speechless. Her movements were efficient and confident, her handling of the hot barrel demonstrated proper safety protocols, and her completion of the procedure was faster than Morrison's own demonstration. The other soldiers in the room exchanged uncomfortable glances as their assumptions about her capabilities began to crumble. Corporal Davis, a machine gunner from another squad who'd been observing the training, stepped forward with a challenge that carried personal vindictiveness. "That's all fine for peacetime training," he said, his voice loaded with contempt. "But let's see how you handle the real test. Combat loading." His suggestion drew nods of approval from the gathered soldiers. This would be the moment when physics finally proved their point. Combat loading involved carrying the M240 along with a complete combat load of ammunition, spare barrels, tripod, and additional equipment that simulated battlefield conditions. The total weight approached 100 pounds, distributed across a soldier's body in ways that tested endurance, balance, and core strength. It was the ultimate physical test for heavy weapons personnel, and Morrison smiled as he began assembling the full equipment load. "Ruiz," Morrison announced loudly enough to attract attention from soldiers throughout the building. We're going to load you up with a realistic combat configuration. If you can carry this equipment 200 meters to the outdoor range and back, we'll consider that you've passed basic physical requirements." His challenge was delivered with absolute confidence. There was no possibility that Sam could complete this test successfully. Word of the challenge spread rapidly through Building 47. Soldiers abandoned their training exercises to witness what they expected would be the definitive end to Sam's unrealistic aspirations. The crowd that gathered included not just heavy weapons personnel, but soldiers from other specialties who'd heard about the ongoing spectacle. Phones appeared despite regulations, soldiers positioning themselves to capture the moment when Sam finally acknowledged her limitations. The equipment was assembled with theatrical precision. Morrison personally verified each component's weight, announcing the specifications for the benefit of the growing audience. M240 Bravo, 27 pounds. Combat load of linked ammunition, 32 pounds. Spare barrels, 8 pounds. Tripod assembly, 16 pounds. Additional gear and equipment, 15 pounds. Total combat load, 98 pounds. As Morrison called out each specification, the crowd's anticipation grew. Soldiers began placing informal bets on how far Sam would make it before collapsing or requesting assistance. The consensus was that she wouldn't make it halfway to the outdoor range before the weight overwhelmed her small frame. But the cruelest challenge came from an unexpected source. Master Sergeant Robert Chun, a grizzled veteran with deployments in both Iraq and Afghanistan, pushed through the crowd with visible anger. Chun had lost soldiers under his command to inadequate fire support, and Sam's presence in the Heavy Weapons Division represented something he took as a personal insult to their memory. "This is bullshit," Chun announced, his voice cutting through the crowd's murmur like a blade. "We're treating this like some kind of game when people's lives depend on machine gun teams performing when it matters." His words carried the authority of someone speaking from painful experience, and the crowd fell silent to hear his perspective. Chun approached Sam directly, his weathered face showing the kind of anger that came from seeing too many good soldiers die. "Specialist, I want you to look me in the eye and tell me that when 200 enemy fighters are trying to overrun a position, and your squad is depending on suppressive fire to survive, you can deliver that fire for hours without failing them." The question hung in the air like an accusation. Chun continued his assault on Sam's credibility with the focused intensity of someone delivering a moral judgment. "I've carried wounded soldiers who died because their fire support couldn't maintain effective coverage. I've written letters to mothers whose sons paid the price for weak links in the chain of command. Are you prepared to tell me that your determination is worth risking other soldiers' lives?" The crowd had grown silent, recognizing that Chun's challenge went beyond physical capabilities to question Sam's moral right to put others at risk. This wasn't about discrimination or fairness. This was about combat effectiveness and the responsibility that came with carrying weapons that others depended on for survival. Sam stood motionless under Chun's verbal assault, her brown eyes meeting his with steady directness. The weight of his words was heavier than any equipment she might carry, and every soldier present understood that this was the moment when noble intentions collided with battlefield realities. "Master Sergeant," Sam replied quietly, her voice carrying across the silent room, "I understand the responsibility that comes with this specialization. I'm not asking for special treatment or accommodation. I'm asking for the opportunity to prove that capability isn't determined by size alone." Chun's response was immediate and devastating. "Prove it? Specialist, this isn't a training exercise where failure means embarrassment. This is about life and death, and I won't watch good. Soldiers die because someone wanted to make a political statement about inclusion." The silence that followed was thick with tension. Sam had reached the breaking point, the moment when the full weight of institutional resistance, physical challenges, and moral questioning converged into a test that went far beyond her ability to carry equipment or operate machinery. But instead of braking, Sam surprised everyone by reaching for the combat load that Morrison had assembled. "Then let's stop talking," she said simply, "and find out what I can actually do." The combat load settled onto Sam's frame with the weight of institutional expectations and personal vindication. The assembled crowd watched with a mixture of anticipation and discomfort as she adjusted the equipment with movements that spoke of careful preparation and understanding that went beyond casual familiarity. What they expected to see was immediate struggle, a small soldier overwhelmed by equipment designed for much larger operators. What they witnessed instead was the beginning of a systematic dismantling of everything they thought they knew about physical capability and combat effectiveness. Sam's first steps with the full combat load were measured and deliberate. Instead of the stumbling or obvious strain that Morrison and his colleagues had anticipated, she moved with the controlled gait of someone who understood how to distribute weight efficiently across her frame. Her breathing remained steady, her posture erect, and her pace consistent as she began the 200-meter trek to the outdoor training range. The crowd followed at a distance, phones recording and voices murmuring as they processed what they were witnessing. Corporal Hendricks, whose football background had given him extensive experience with weight training and physical conditioning, found himself struggling to reconcile Sam's apparent ease with the mathematical reality of the load she was carrying. "She's compensating," he whispered to Morrison, seeking an explanation that would restore his confidence in their collective judgment. "Adrenaline can mask fatigue for short periods. Wait until she has to sustain this over longer distances." Morrison nodded agreement, but his expression carried less certainty than it had just minutes earlier. The outdoor range stretched across several acres of Carolina countryside, with firing positions marked at various distances and target systems designed to test accuracy under different conditions. Sam reached the 100-meter mark without visible signs of distress, her pace unchanged and her equipment properly secured. The crowd's murmurs grew more subdued as soldiers began to acknowledge that their expectations weren't aligning with reality. At the 150-meter point, something remarkable happened. Sam's movement began to demonstrate efficiency that went beyond simple endurance. Her footwork showed understanding of how to maintain balance with asymmetrical loads. Her breathing pattern indicated training and sustained physical effort. And her overall technique suggested experience that none of them had anticipated. This wasn't beginner's luck or determination overcoming physics. This was competent performance that challenged their fundamental assumptions. Master Sergeant Chun, who had delivered the moral challenge that was supposed to end Sam's aspirations, found himself studying her movement with the analytical eye of someone reassessing an initial judgment. "Her center of gravity management is textbook," he said quietly to Sergeant Bradley. "That's not natural talent, that's training." The 200-meter checkpoint was reached with Sam showing no signs of the fatigue or instability that should have been obvious by this point. She executed a precise turn and began the return journey with the same controlled pace that had carried her to the range. The crowd's confidence in their predictions began to evaporate as they realized they were witnessing something that contradicted their most basic beliefs about physical limitations and combat capability. Morrison, whose role as her assessor had made him the focal point of the exercise, felt compelled to escalate the challenge. "All right, Ruiz," he called out as Sam approached the halfway point of her return journey. "You've shown you can carry the load. Now let's see how you handle it under stress. Double time back to the building." The demand for increased pace was designed to finally expose the limitations that sustained walking had failed to reveal. Running, with 98 pounds of equipment, would test not just strength, but cardiovascular conditioning, balance, and the kind of physical reserves that combat operations demanded. Morrison's challenge drew approving nods from the gathered soldiers. This would be the moment when physics finally asserted itself, but Sam's response defied their expectations once again. She smoothly transitioned from walking to a controlled jog, her equipment remaining stable and her breathing adapting to the increased demand without obvious strain. Her pace was sustainable rather than desperate, suggesting reserves of conditioning that went far beyond what her appearance indicated. Crowd began to struggle with cognitive dissonance as their observations conflicted with their certainties. Soldiers who had been making jokes about Sam's size found themselves silent, processing performance that didn't fit their mental models of what was possible. Some began to look for alternative explanations. Perhaps the equipment had been miscounted, or the distance measurements were incorrect. Corporal Davis, who had suggested the combat loading challenge, found himself running alongside Sam's route to verify that she wasn't somehow cheating or receiving assistance. What he observed up close was even more unsettling than the crowd's distant perspective. Sam's technique was polished, her equipment properly secured and distributed, and her overall performance indicating capabilities that extended far beyond this single exercise. "Jesus," Davis muttered to himself as he dropped back to rejoin the crowd. "She's not even breathing hard." His observation carried to nearby soldiers, adding to their growing uncertainty about what they were witnessing. The final 50 meters of Sam's return journey were covered with the same controlled efficiency that had characterized her entire performance. As she approached Building 47, the crowd pressed closer, looking for signs of exhaustion or stress that would validate their original assessments. Instead, they saw a soldier who appeared capable of continuing the exercise for considerably longer. Distances. Sam came to a halt outside the building's entrance and began methodically unloading her equipment. Her movements remained precise and controlled, showing none of the haste or relief that would indicate someone who had just completed a grueling physical challenge. She inventoried each piece of gear, ensuring proper placement and condition before turning to address Morrison and the assembled crowd. "Equipment accountability complete," she reported to Morrison, her voice steady and professional. "Ready for the next phase of training." The statement was delivered without bravado or challenge, simply a soldier reporting readiness to continue with assigned duties. The silence that followed was filled with uncomfortable realizations. Morrison found himself in the awkward position of having his carefully designed test not just passed, but completed with apparent ease. The crowd of soldiers who had gathered to witness Sam's failure were instead forced to confront the possibility that their assumptions about her capabilities had been fundamentally wrong. Staff Sergeant Thompson, who had been observing from the building's entrance, approached with an expression that mixed professional assessment with personal confusion. "Impressive performance, Specialist," he said carefully. "But carrying the equipment is just the foundation. The real test comes with actual weapons operation under stress." Thompson's comment reflected the group's desperate need to find some aspect of heavy weapons operation where Sam's limitations would finally become apparent. If basic physical capability wasn't the barrier they had expected, perhaps technical proficiency or stress tolerance would prove their point about her unsuitability for this specialization. "I'm ready to proceed with live fire exercises whenever you determine appropriate, Staff Sergeant," Sam replied. Her response carried the quiet confidence of someone who had just demonstrated capabilities that went far beyond her assessor's expectations. Master Sergeant Chun stepped forward, his earlier moral challenge now tempered by grudging respect for Sam's physical performance. "Specialist," he said slowly, "I'll admit you've exceeded my initial assessment of your physical capabilities. But combat effectiveness requires more than endurance. Are you prepared for weapons qualification under conditions that simulate actual engagement scenarios?" Sam's brown eyes met Chun's with steady directness. "Master Sergeant, I've been preparing for this qualification for longer than you might expect. I'm ready for whatever evaluation you consider appropriate." The crowd began to disperse, soldiers returning to their duties with considerably less confidence in their predictions about Sam's eventual failure. Morrison found himself facing the uncomfortable realization that his role as Sam's assessor might require actually teaching someone who appeared more prepared than he had anticipated. As the immediate spectacle ended, whispered conversations spread. Throughout Building 47, soldiers who had been certain about Sam's limitations found themselves questioning not just their assessment of her capabilities, but their understanding of what physical competence actually looked like in practice. Live fire range at Fort Braxton stretched across a valley that had witnessed decades of machine gun qualification exercises. Concrete bunkers positioned at 300, 600, and 800-meter intervals housed target systems designed to test accuracy, sustained fire capability, and tactical employment of heavy weapons. The morning air carried the acrid scent of cordite from earlier training sessions, and the distant mountains provided a backdrop that seemed to emphasize the seriousness of what was about to unfold. Sam approached firing position Alpha with the Pathé M240 Bravo cradled in her arms like a familiar tool rather than an intimidating weapon. The position featured a reinforced concrete platform with sandbag emplacements designed to provide stable firing positions for qualification exercises. What made this different from her earlier physical demonstration was that here, technique would matter more than endurance, and precision would prove more valuable than raw strength. Staff Sergeant Thompson had assembled a formal evaluation board, consisting of Master Sergeant Chun Morrison as the primary instructor, and Sergeant Bradley as the technical observer. Their role was to assess Sam's performance against standardized qualification criteria, but their personal investment in the outcome went far beyond professional obligation. Each man carried assumptions about combat effectiveness that Sam's success would fundamentally challenge. "All right, Specialist Ruiz," Thompson announced, his voice carrying the formal tone reserved for official evaluations. "You'll be firing a standard qualification course consisting of 40 rounds at multiple target arrays. Scoring is based on accuracy, time limits, and proper weapons handling throughout the exercise." He paused, studying Sam's composed expression, before adding, "This isn't basic marksmanship. Machine gun qualification requires sustained, accurate fire under time pressure." The gathered observers included soldiers from throughout the Heavy Weapons Division who had abandoned their own training to witness what many still expected would be Sam's definitive failure. The crowd was smaller than during her physical demonstration, but more focused. These were professionals who understood the technical demands of machine gun operation and could evaluate performance with informed perspective. Morrison positioned himself beside Sam's firing position with the authority of someone about to oversee a predictable outcome. "First exercise is 10 rounds at 300 meters, standing supported position. 60-second time limit," he announced. "Target array consists of multiple silhouettes simulating enemy positions. Minimum score for qualification is 7 hits out of 10. Sam settled into her firing position with movements that demonstrated familiarity with the weapon system that went beyond her recent familiarization training. Her grip on the M240 was confident and controlled, her stance balanced and sustainable. But what drew immediate attention from the observing instructors was her approach to sight alignment. She worked with the iron sights as if they were precision instruments rather than approximate aiming devices. "Ready on the firing line," Morrison called out, raising his hand to signal the beginning of the exercise. "Commence firing when ready." The first burst from Sam's M240 was a controlled, 3-round group that struck the center target with precision that silenced the casual conversation among observers. The weapon's recoil, which should have challenged a shooter of her size, seemed to be absorbed and controlled with technique that spoke of extensive training. Her follow-up bursts were equally precise, each engaging a different target in the array with methodical accuracy. Master Sergeant Chun found himself leaning forward, studying Sam's shooting technique with the analytical focus of someone reassessing fundamental assumptions. "Her recoil management is exceptional," he muttered to Thompson. "That's not beginner's performance, that's advanced marksmanship." The 60-second time limit expired with Sam having fired her allocated 10 rounds in controlled, deliberate bursts. Morrison approached the spotting scope to assess her target engagement, expecting to find the marginal performance that would finally expose her limitations. Instead, he discovered shot groups that exceeded qualification standards by significant margins. 10 for 10, Morrison announced, his voice betraying confusion rather than the satisfaction he'd expected to feel. All targets engaged, all hits scored in vital zones. The crowd's reaction was a mixture of surprise and uncomfortable silence as soldiers processed results that contradicted their certainties about Sam's capabilities. The second exercise escalated the difficulty significantly. Prone supported position, 600 meters, 15 rounds in 90 seconds, Thompson called out. Target array includes moving elements and partial concealment. This simulates actual engagement scenarios where machine gunners provide suppressive fire for advancing infantry. Sam transitioned to the prone position with fluid efficiency, the M240's bipod legs deploying smoothly as she settled into a stable firing platform. Her breathing pattern indicated training in sustained fire techniques, and her approach to the more challenging targets suggested tactical understanding that went beyond mechanical operation of the weapon system. The longer engagement distance should have exposed any limitations in Sam's marksmanship training. Machine gun effectiveness at 600 meters required understanding of trajectory, wind compensation, and ammunition ballistics that typically came only through extensive range time and expert instruction. Morrison watched through binoculars, expecting to finally witness the performance degradation that would validate his assumptions. Instead, Sam's engagement of the 600-meter targets was devastatingly effective. Her bursts were precisely controlled. Her target selection showed tactical awareness of priority threats, and her overall performance indicated capabilities that extended far beyond basic qualification requirements. Moving targets were engaged with leading techniques that demonstrated advanced marksmanship training, and partially concealed targets were engaged with precision that suggested combat-level proficiency. 15 for 15, Morrison reported, his voice now carrying genuine amazement rather than skeptical assessment. Perfect score on moving targets, perfect score on stationary threats. Shot groups are well within expert-level standards. Sergeant Bradley, whose family military tradition had given him extensive exposure to machine gun tactics, found himself struggling to process what he was witnessing. Thompson, he said quietly, this isn't qualification-level shooting. This is instructor-level performance. The final exercise represented the most demanding test in the qualification sequence. Transition drill, Thompson announced. Multiple firing positions, 800-meter engagement, 15 rounds total with mandatory position changes every 5 rounds. Time limit, 2 minutes. This exercise tested not just marksmanship but the physical and mental agility required for tactical employment of machine guns under combat conditions. Sam's performance during the transition drill was a masterclass in advanced machine gun tactics. Her movement between positions was efficient and tactical, maintaining proper muzzle control while relocating the weapon system. Her engagement of targets at maximum range demonstrated understanding of long-range ballistics that typically required months of advanced training to develop, but it was during the final firing position that Sam revealed capabilities that transcended qualification standards entirely. Engaging targets at 800 meters while maintaining the rapid pace required by the exercise time limit, she demonstrated shooting skills that approached the legendary levels associated with special operations personnel. Her shot placement was consistently precise, her weapons handling was flawless, and her overall performance indicated training that went far beyond standard military instruction. Time, Thompson called out as the 2-minute limit expired. The silence that followed was filled with the sound of brass cases settling and the distant echo of Sam's final shots. Morrison approached the spotting scope with hands that trembled. Slightly, no longer confident in what he would discover. "Perfect score," Morrison announced, his voice barely audible. 15 for 15 at 800 meters. Shot groups that would qualify for advanced marksmanship instructor certification. He lowered the binoculars and stared at Sam with an expression that mixed respect with bewilderment. "Where the hell did you learn to shoot like that?" Master Sergeant Chun stepped forward, his earlier moral challenges forgotten in the face of demonstrated competence that exceeded his own considerable abilities. "Specialist Ruiz," he said slowly, "I owe you an apology. That wasn't just qualification. That was a demonstration of expertise that most of my instructors couldn't match." Sam safed her weapon and began the methodical process of clearing and inspecting the M240, her movements continuing to demonstrate the professional competence that had characterized her entire performance. "Master Sergeant," she replied quietly, "I told you I was prepared. My father taught me that capability speaks louder than assumptions." The mention of her father sent ripples of curiosity through the assembled observers. Thompson found himself wondering what kind of training could have produced such exceptional marksmanship in someone who appeared so unlikely to possess it. "Your father was military?" he asked. Sam's brown eyes met his with steady directness. "Staff Sergeant Miguel. Ruiz, 75th Ranger Regiment. 3 deployments, Silver Star recipient. He taught me that precision matters more than size, and that the best machine gunners are made through dedication, not genetics." The revelation hit the assembled soldiers like a physical blow. The 75th Ranger Regiment represented the elite of Army infantry, and Silver Star recipients were legendary figures whose combat prowess was beyond question. Sam hadn't just demonstrated exceptional shooting. She had revealed training that came from one of the Army's most decorated warriors. Morrison found himself facing the uncomfortable realization that he had been teaching someone whose preparation exceeded his own. The crowd of observers began to disperse, soldiers returning to their duties with fundamentally altered perceptions of what they had witnessed and what it meant for their understanding of combat effectiveness. The silence that followed Sam's revelation about her father stretched across the firing range like the aftermath of an explosion. Staff Sergeant Thompson stood frozen, his clipboard forgotten in hands that had unconsciously clenched into fists. The name Miguel Ruiz was legend among career infantry soldiers, a ranger whose exploits in Afghanistan had become the stuff of whispered stories in NCO clubs and training centers across the Army. Thompson himself had heard accounts of Ruiz's actions during Operation Red Wing 2, where a single machine gunner had held off an entire Taliban company for 6 hours until reinforcements arrived. Master Sergeant Chun's weathered face had gone pale beneath his tan, his eyes searching Sam's features for resemblances to a man he'd served alongside during his second deployment. "Miguel Ruiz," Chun repeated slowly, as if testing the weight of the name. "Ghost Company, 2nd Battalion, that Miguel Ruiz?" His voice carried the reverence reserved for speaking of the dead, though Ruiz had survived his deployments only to die in a training accident 3 years after returning home. "That's my father," Sam confirmed, her voice carrying quiet pride mixed with old grief. "He died when I was 16, but he'd been training me since I was 8 years old. Every weekend, every summer break, every moment he could spare from his duties." She paused, her brown eyes distant with memory. "He said that if I was going to be small, I'd better be perfect." Morrison felt the world shifting beneath his feet as he processed the implications of what he'd just witnessed. For months, he'd been considered the division's rising star, the poster soldier whose recruiting videos and demonstration performances had made him the face of heavy weapons excellence. In the span of one afternoon, a woman he'd dismissed as a curiosity had demonstrated skills that made his own capabilities look amateur by comparison. "How?" Morrison asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "How did you learn to shoot like that?" The question carried desperation. Need to understand how his carefully constructed identity as an elite soldier had been so thoroughly eclipsed by someone he'd never taken seriously. Sam's response was measured and precise, delivered without malice, but with the authority of someone who'd earned the right to speak on technical matters. My father believed that machine gun effectiveness came from understanding the weapon as an extension of your body rather than trying to overpower it through size and strength. He taught me that recoil management was about technique and timing, not mass. That accuracy came from consistency and discipline, not brute force. The technical explanation hit the assembled soldiers like a lecture on physics, delivered by someone who'd actually applied the theories in practice. Everything they'd been taught about machine gun operation had emphasized physical dominance over mechanical precision, yet Sam's performance had demonstrated that their foundational assumptions were not just wrong but counterproductive. Corporal Hendricks, whose football background had shaped his approach to military training, found himself questioning years of conditioning that had equated physical size with tactical effectiveness. All those hours in the gym, he muttered to himself. All that emphasis on bulk and strength, and none of it mattered. His identity as a physically superior soldier was crumbling as he realized that technique had trumped power in the most decisive way possible. Captain Hayes arrived at the firing range in response to radio reports about unusual qualification results that had reached the company command post. His stride carried the confidence of an officer expecting to resolve a minor administrative issue, but his expression changed dramatically as he processed the scene before him. Thompson's pale face, Morrison's stunned silence, and the general atmosphere of shock suggested something far more significant than routine training. "What the hell is going on here?" Hayes demanded, his eyes moving between the assembled soldiers and the target arrays that still displayed the evidence of Sam's performance. "I'm getting reports about perfect scores and requests for instructor evaluations. Someone explain what happened." Thompson found his voice, though it carried none of its usual authority. "Sir, Specialist Ruiz has completed machine gun qualification with scores that exceed advanced instructor standards. Perfect accuracy at all engagement ranges, flawless tactical transitions, and weapons handling that." He paused, struggling to find words that would convey the magnitude of what they'd witnessed. "Sir, I've never seen shooting like that in 15 years of running this program." Hayes's initial reaction was skepticism bordering on disbelief. "That's impossible. I saw her this morning. She's barely big enough to carry the weapon, let alone achieve instructor-level scores." But the expressions on his subordinates' faces suggested that something unprecedented had occurred, something that challenged his own understanding of combat capabilities. "Sir," Master Sergeant Chun interjected, "Specialist Ruiz is the daughter of Staff Sergeant Miguel Ruiz, 75th Rangers, Silver Star recipient. She's been trained by one of the Army's most decorated machine gunners since childhood." The revelation carried weight that even Hayes couldn't dismiss. Miguel Ruiz's reputation was legendary enough to command respect from any career infantry officer. The implications began cascading through Hayes's mind as he processed what he was hearing. His public humiliation of Sam during morning formation had been witnessed by dozens of soldiers and recorded on multiple phones. If she had indeed demonstrated exceptional capabilities, his earlier comments about her unsuitability would look like prejudiced incompetence rather than professional assessment. "I want to see those targets," Hayes demanded, moving toward the spotting scopes with forced confidence. What he discovered through the magnified optics made his stomach drop. The shot groups were tight enough to be mistaken for single holes, placed with precision that he couldn't have achieved with his best effort and perfect conditions. Sergeant Bradley, whose family military tradition had given him exposure to genuine excellence, stepped forward with uncomfortable honesty. "Sir, I've been around machine guns my entire life. My grandfather, my father, 2 uncles, all heavy weapons specialists. I've never seen shooting like what we just witnessed." This wasn't qualification, this was a masterclass. The weight of institutional embarrassment settled over the assembled leadership as they realized the magnitude of their misjudgment. Sam hadn't just proven her competence, she had demonstrated superiority that made their earlier resistance look like the prejudiced incompetence it had always been. Morrison faced the personal devastation of watching his carefully constructed reputation crumble in real time. His social media followers, his recruiting appearances, his status as the division's exemplar, all of it suddenly seemed hollow when compared to genuine expertise demonstrated under pressure. "I don't understand," he said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else. "Everything I was taught, everything I believed about this job... Sam's response was delivered without cruelty, but with the clarity of someone who'd spent years understanding truths that others had never been forced to confront. "Specialist Morrison, you were taught that bigger was better because that's what people wanted to believe. My father learned in combat that effectiveness comes from precision, discipline, and understanding your weapon better than the enemy understands theirs." The crowd of observers began to disperse, soldiers returning to their duties with fundamentally altered perspectives on what they'd witnessed. Conversations erupted throughout Building 47 as news of Sam's performance spread, carried by soldiers who struggled to find words for what they'd seen. Captain Hayes found himself facing a command decision that would determine not just Sam's future but his own credibility as a leader. Rejecting her qualification despite perfect scores would expose him to charges of discrimination and prejudice, while accepting it would require acknowledging that his earlier assessment had been catastrophically wrong. "Specialist Ruiz," Hayes said finally, his voice carefully controlled, "your qualification scores are exceptional. You've earned advanced designation with scores that exceed most of our instructor staff." The admission was delivered through gritted teeth, but regulations and witness performance left him no alternative. Thompson faced his own moment of reckoning as he realized that his assumptions about physical requirements had blinded him to genuine capability. "Specialist," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology. My assessment of your suitability was based on prejudice rather than performance, and I was wrong." Sam accepted the acknowledgments with the quiet dignity of someone who'd never doubted the outcome, only the fairness of the process. "Staff Sergeant, I understand why you made those assumptions. I'm just grateful for the opportunity to demonstrate what training and dedication can accomplish regardless of physical appearance." As the immediate shock began to subside, the broader implications of Sam's performance started to emerge. Word was already spreading beyond the heavy weapons division, carried by soldiers whose phones had captured not just her shooting, but the reactions of leadership who'd been forced to confront their own biases, the woman who'd been dismissed as too small to carry a machine gun had not only qualified, but had done so with a performance that would become legendary throughout Fort Braxton. The real reckoning was just beginning. 6 months after Sam Ruiz's legendary qualification performance, Fort Braxton's Heavy Weapons Division had undergone a transformation that extended far beyond personnel changes. The concrete walls of Building 47 still housed the same equipment and training facilities, but the culture that had once prized physical intimidation over tactical competence had been systematically dismantled and rebuilt around principles of performance-based evaluation. Changes began within hours of Sam's demonstration. Video footage of her shooting, captured on soldiers' phones despite regulations, had spread through military social media networks with viral intensity. The contrast between her diminutive appearance and devastating accuracy became a symbol that resonated far beyond Fort Braxton, inspiring discussions about inclusion, capability, and the danger of assumptions across military installations worldwide. Staff Sergeant Thompson found himself at the center of an institutional revolution he'd never intended to spark. The Army's Training and Doctrine Command had dispatched evaluation teams to study the Heavy Weapons Division's training methodologies, seeking to understand how traditional approaches had failed to identify exceptional capability. Thompson's honest assessment of his own prejudices became a case study in leadership training programs, though the personal cost of that honesty had been significant. "I spent 15 years confusing intimidation with competence," Thompson admitted during one of many interviews conducted by military researchers. Specialist Ruiz taught me that the most dangerous assumption in combat is believing that capability looks a certain way. Size doesn't pull triggers, skill does. Morrison's career had taken an unexpected trajectory following his public humiliation. Rather than allowing bitterness to consume him, he'd requested assignment as Sam's training partner, seeking to learn the precision techniques that had made her legendary. His social media presence, once focused on displaying physical prowess, had evolved into educational content about advanced marksmanship principles. The transformation from poster boy to serious student had earned him respect that his previous swagger never could. "Sam taught me the difference between looking like a soldier and being one," Morrison reflected during a training demonstration 6 months later. "I spent years building muscles when I should have been building skills. Strength matters, but precision matters more." His willingness to publicly acknowledge his errors had become a model for professional growth that other soldiers began emulating. Master Sergeant Chun had perhaps experienced the most profound personal transformation. His initial moral challenges to Sam had been based on genuine combat experience, but witnessing her capabilities had forced him to examine his own assumptions about what made soldiers effective under fire. He'd become an advocate for performance-based evaluation systems that looked beyond traditional physical markers. "In combat, I want the soldier who can consistently hit targets under pressure," Chun explained to a group of visiting officers from other installations. Specialist Ruiz proved that technique and training matter more than size and strength. If someone can put rounds on target when it counts, everything else is just prejudice. The institutional changes at Fort Braxton became a template for reforms across the Army's training establishment. The Heavy Weapons Division's new evaluation protocols emphasized shooting proficiency, tactical understanding, and equipment mastery over physical presence. Qualification standards were revised to focus on performance metrics rather than subjective assessments of suitability. Captain Hayes had faced a choice between defending his earlier prejudices or embracing the evidence of his mistakes. His decision to publicly acknowledge Sam's exceptional capabilities and formally apologize for his discriminatory behavior had saved his career while setting a precedent for leadership accountability. He'd become an unexpected champion of inclusive evaluation practices, though the personal cost of admitting such fundamental errors continued to affect his confidence. Leaders who can't acknowledge when they're wrong don't deserve to lead soldiers. Into combat, Hayes told a gathering of company commanders from across the southeastern United States. Specialist Ruiz didn't just prove she belonged, she proved that our entire approach to assessment was flawed. Good leaders learn from their mistakes rather than defending them. Sam herself had become something she'd never sought to be, a symbol of capability over appearance that inspired soldiers throughout the military. Requests for interviews, speaking engagements, and training demonstrations arrived daily, though she declined most of them in favor of focusing on her duties as a newly certified machine gun instructor. Her teaching methods, developed from her father's techniques and refined through her own experience, emphasized precision over power in ways that revolutionized how heavy weapons training was conducted. Students who'd struggled with traditional strength-based approaches found success through Sam's emphasis on technique, breathing control, and mechanical understanding of weapon systems. "My father taught me that the best teachers are those who can help others discover capabilities they didn't know they possessed," Sam explained to a group of instructor candidates. Physical size is just one factor among many. Intelligence, discipline, and dedication matter more in the long run. The broader impact of Sam's story extended beyond military training to influence recruitment and retention policies. The Army had recognized that dismissing capable soldiers based on appearance represented a massive waste of human resources. New recruitment materials featured diverse examples of military excellence, and evaluation procedures were revised to identify talent that traditional assessments might have overlooked. Corporal Hendricks had transitioned from football-inspired physical training to precision-focused skill development, discovering that his natural coordination made him an excellent student of Sam's techniques. His transformation from skeptic to advocate became another example of how the division's culture had evolved to value growth over ego. I spent years thinking that being the biggest guy in the room made me the best soldier, Hendricks admitted during a leadership development seminar. Sam showed me that being the most skilled soldier in the room was what actually mattered. Size can be intimidating, but competence is what wins battles. The memorial service for Staff Sergeant Miguel Ruiz, held on the first anniversary of Sam's qualification performance, drew hundreds of soldiers who'd been inspired by his daughter's demonstration of the principles he'd taught her. The ceremony celebrated both his combat legacy and the training philosophy that had produced a daughter capable of changing institutional culture through performance rather than politics. Command Sergeant Major Patricia Collins, who'd witnessed the entire transformation from advocate to observer to institutional reformer, reflected on the broader implications of what had occurred. Specialist Ruiz didn't just qualify as a machine gunner, Collins noted during the memorial service. She qualified as a teacher, a leader, and a symbol of what the Army can become when we evaluate soldiers based on capability rather than assumptions. The story of Sam Ruiz became required reading in leadership development programs, a case study in the dangers of prejudice and the power of performance-based evaluation. Military academies incorporated her story into courses on inclusive leadership, using her experience to teach future officers about recognizing capability in unexpected forms. 2 years after her legendary qualification, Sam received orders for deployment to an overseas assignment where her skills would be tested under actual combat conditions. The Heavy Weapons Division she left behind bore little resemblance to the institution she'd first encountered. It had evolved from a bastion of physical intimidation into a center of excellence that valued precision, professionalism, and proven performance. Morrison, now serving as senior instructor in Sam's absence, often addressed new students with words that had become the division's unofficial motto. Your weapon doesn't care how big you are. Your enemy doesn't care how strong you look. Only your skill, your training, and your dedication matter when lives depend on your performance. The concrete walls of Building 47 still displayed photographs of legendary machine gunners from previous conflicts, but new images had been added, pictures of Sam Ruiz, demonstrating that legends weren't defined by appearance, but by the courage to prove capability when others believed it impossible. Her legacy lived on in every soldier who learned that excellence came through dedication, rather than genetics. In every leader who chose performance over prejudice, and in every institution that recognized that the most dangerous assumptions were those that prevented capable people from proving what they could accomplish. The woman who'd been deemed too small for heavy weapons had become larger than life, not through size or strength, but through the simple act of letting her performance speak louder than anyone's words ever could. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.